Thank you. And first, my thanks to the organizers of the conference for inviting me to address you on the issue of land, which we already by now realized is one of the most important issues facing India and many other countries. Mine is an academic keynote, and I'm an academic, so my talk would be based on academic research, but I don't believe in pure academic research. I want research to have academic input, to a policy input. So what I'm going to talk about will have some policy implications, even though it's based on academic research. However, let me start by saying that so far in the earlier session, we have talked mostly about land acquisition, and I'm also going to talk quite a bit about land acquisition. In fact, I'm going to go into some issues which Mr. Panda has already covered, and in fact, in some respects, I quite agree with him. I'll come back to those. But before that, since this conference is on politics and economics of land, not just land acquisition, I'm going to start with some other land issues, not just acquisition, even though politically that's become now the most salient one in Indian and South Asian politics. So, for example, some years back, if you ask people, what is the main issue, politics and economics of land? People will say land reform. Land reform in the sense of redistribution of land among the landless, land reform in the sense of giving sharecroppers permanent rights of cultivation or secure rights of cultivation, and so on. Today we don't hear about that, not because those issues have gone away, but because politically some other issues have become salient. So I'm going to start actually with land reforms. And this is also partly based on my own research with a whole team of people that we have been doing. So I'm going to talk about 5 issues. They look a little academic, but I'm going to skip a lot of the standard academic technicalities. So these are the 5 issues I'm going to talk about. The last issue, which since my talk is on land and equity, the last issue is intersectoral equity, and that's where the land acquisition issue will come out. But before that, I'm going to talk a little bit about 4 others. The first, on land reform, let me say that land reform is a topic where you address both equity and efficiency. One of the very few subjects where something is good for, if you carry it out properly, it's good for both efficiency and equity. Equity is easy to understand. Why efficiency? Because land reform, if it's carried out properly, also improves productivity. And this is where the first piece of research of myself and a whole team of co-authors and others worked on, to find out, for example, in the state in India where I am from, West Bengal, did carry out some land reform, primarily some redistribution of land among the landless and securing the rights of sharecroppers. How much improvement it contributed to productivity. For the last 15, 20 years, we have been going back to the same villages. It's a sample village, sample about 90 villages in West Bengal. It's a sample is chosen such that whatever results we get from those villages, we can generalize for the whole of West Bengal. And we find, yes, land reform, at least in the initial years, led to a very large, significant rise in land productivity. So land reform helps efficiency, not just equity. But then something surprised us. And this is, remember, the subtitle of my talk is Some Understudied Issues. The one understudied issue is that quite often we don't realize the process through which land reform is helping us. In the case of West Bengal sample that we've been studied, we are going back to the same villages, we found that land reform improved productivity, say of the sharecroppers, yes, but not just only of the sharecroppers. Sharecroppers were about 10% of the farmers in our sample. Land reform, say, giving more secure rights to the sharecroppers, also improved the productivity of the rest 90% of the farmers. And that's puzzled us. So that's the first topic there, what in economic terminology, a general equilibrium as opposed to partial equilibrium effects of land reform, it helps others as well. Or there are spillovers of land reform. So we studied that issue. Why is it land reform in West Bengal in the initial years, from late 70s to about middle 1990s, improved productivity not just of those who got land rights, but also others? In an investigation, we found that once land reform was in place, it induced investment by, for example, those who sell water, irrigation water, pumps, tubewells, water. They knew that because of the sharecropper land reform, the demand for water will increase because they now have secure rights, they will invest in water. So the water sellers, the water selling individuals and companies invested more. And with economies of scale, that brought down, other things remaining the same, that brought down the irrigation price, which then everybody benefited from, not just the sharecroppers. 90% of the farmers are not sharecroppers, but they also benefited from this extra investment in water. So that's just an example of the first effect of spillover effect. And in fact, we found the spillover effect is many times the direct effect on the sharecroppers themselves. That's the first point that I want to, and this is a point I have not seen any other studies, and I think this needs to be confirmed or rejected with other studies. So that's why I'm calling it an understudied issue. Let me now go to the second understudied issues. And this is also something that is very much requires to be done in terms of both academic research and policy inputs to policy. So the first point was that the good effect of land reform was more than what is usually attributed to it. Second point is the opposite. I'm going to show that the effect of land reform on land equity is quite often exaggerated. In fact, in trying to figure out what helps land equity, other effects, other factors are much more important than land reform. And for this, we carried out another study. And this is a study in West Bengal, the same villages, because we have a sample of 90 villages. As I said, we are going back to the same, for the last 15, 20 years, we are going back to the set of the same villages. So in that sample, we have 2,400 households, mostly farmer households. We then collected data on what we call land history. And the history in our sample was from 1967 to 2004. So a little, say 35, almost a little less than 4 decades. So we asked each household about the land history. How much land they originally had, how much land passed, there were land transactions, how much land they got because of land reform, how much land they got out of the household because of division of the household, and so on. So we have a detailed data of land history. And we found out that much more than land reform, what affected inequality of land distribution is demographic issues. And let me explain that for a minute. So, and this is something that I think Mr. Panda also referred to about land fragmentation. So in India, because of our inheritance system, land gets passed on to several children. It used to be mostly male children, but now also to women. But whatever the number of children, it gets distributed. So each generation, the land becomes smaller and smaller. Okay? That is a direct effect on land equity. So if rich farmers' land gets divided, inequality goes down. But majority of farmers are not rich farmers. The majority of farmers, middle, small, marginal farmers. But the same division applies. And we found that as a result of small farmers' land also being divided, some of them fell below the minimum viable size. In West Bengal, in our calculation, the minimum viable size is roughly half acre. So as they become smaller and smaller, in fact, in those 67 to 2004, land per household became half, as fast as that. So we found that in that case, the larger number of smaller farmers' land being divided, and some of them no longer could cultivate because it's not below the viable size of land. So as a result, if you become landless or you don't cultivate land anymore, inequality increases. And being the larger number being in the small farmers, the net effect was of this inheritance, the net effect was inequality increased, landlessness increased. So then we studied between 1967 and 2004, of the total land inequality went up, even though there are a lot of land reforms. So we found out of the total rise in land inequality, what is the effect of different factors? What is the effect of land reform? What is the effect of household division? What is the effect of market transaction, because you buy and sell land? So we decomposed the effect on land distribution. And we found the predominant factor, in fact, of a given rise in land inequality, about 80% in our sample, 80% of the rise in land inequality is because of those household division, the demographic effect, inheritance effect. Land reform, even though it was significant in West Bengal, constituted a tiny percentage of the total change in inequality. So that's my second point. This is also an understudied issue. I have not seen this done for many other areas, that the effect of land reform on land equity is quite often exaggerated. The main effect that is going on is demography. So in other words, demography trumps politics on this issue. So that's my second. My third and is land to the tiller. So now, in fact, the third issue, the land to the tiller, which used to be a very familiar slogan is no longer that relevant. In our sample, average agricultural land per household became less than half within 3 decades, and many households, as I have already mentioned, fell below the minimum viable size. And I have already said, inexorable forces of demography will make the situation worse in the foreseeable future. So there is need for collective action because you're falling below the viable size. Now, some leftists would say cooperative farming, but I don't think that will work. But we can attempt cooperative buying of inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, water, etc., cooperative marketing of input, common infrastructure, knowledge and risk pooling, etc. In all this, we should encourage cooperation, not necessarily cooperative farming. As retail chains and contract farming grow in importance, their tendency in saving transaction costs is to deal only with large farmers. Cooperatives of small farmers may be the only way of countering this, otherwise they will get marginalized. This is an all-India problem, but in densely populated parts of the country like West Bengal, the problem is acute. In some parts of Madhya Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, small farmers have started forming farmers' companies, particularly in bargaining with suppliers and traders, and in having access to cold storage and transport for commercial crops. Very few studies on the factors helping or hindering when does it succeed in forming such farmer associations or cooperatives, and when it fails is an understudied issue. Next. My fourth point is about gender equity in land. Land inheritance patterns, particularly in Asia, are biased against women. As a result, for example, women in Indian agriculture, unlike in Africa, are in general not cultivators but farm workers, often employed in casual day-to-day tasks like weeding, harvesting, and grain processing. This is one of the major reasons of female poverty and particularly their lack of autonomy and economic security in rural India. Yet, with men moving more into non-farm occupations, agriculture is getting more into the hands of women without a corresponding reflection in changes in property structures. The Indian landowners often discriminate against the daughter in the family in their land bequest on the ostensible ground that they do not want any part of their land to come under the control of her in-laws on marriage, who are usually from a different area. Part of the bequest takes the form of dowry that the daughter takes with her on marriage, but more often than not, it gets under the control of the husband and his family, except possibly her own jewelry. Let me skip some and say, in some states in India, the government has purchased land and transferred it in the names of women from landless households. But, and this is a paradox, there is some evidence, however, from National Family Health Survey data that increased property rights for women lead to more incidents of wife beating in India. And there is some research work on this. There is need, and this is again an understudied issue, there is need for more systematic empirical work on gender inequality in land and its effect on agricultural production and women's efforts to climb out of poverty. As a first step, we need to collect more data, and here there's a big problem. Most of our data are from household surveys, You go to a household and ask questions. And these household surveys will not give you data on asset ownership by individuals. They will tell you how much land the household has. Will not tell you how much of the land belongs to person A, how much to person B, etc. Household data do not give you usually don't give you individual-wise ownership. The only large data set in India, to my knowledge, where gender-wise asset ownership data have been collected is in a sample survey for the state of Karnataka in 2010-11. This is reported in an article. According to this survey, only 14% of agricultural land was owned by individual women in rural Karnataka, 71% by individual men, and 15% under joint ownership, at least on paper. This is so even after the important Hindu Succession Amendment Act of 2005, whereby a gender-equal land inheritance system was formally established for the Hindus all over India. And we don't have any such data for most states in India. There is an article which reports from a sample survey of 504 women in 19 villages of Andhra Pradesh and Bihar that only 8% of the women indicated that they currently own land. Now I'm coming to my last issue, which is about land acquisition, which I call intersectoral equity, land use in one sector rather than in another sector, agriculture or industry or some other commercial sector. As land as a source of income is declining in importance, agriculture now contributes about 15% of national income in India, even though nearly half of our people still are dependent on agriculture. It contributes only 15% of national income. And old issues like land reform, as I've already mentioned, are now fairly low in the political agenda in many countries and certainly in India. An intersectoral equity issue relating to land is increasing in importance. Now, this issue of land acquisition has, of course, become a politically explosive issue in India. Particularly, we have heard stories from West Bengal, Odisha, Uttar Pradesh, and other parts. Now, again, why am I calling it an understudied issue? Yes, there are lots of opinion pieces in newspapers, but very few serious empirical studies on land acquisition. Let me now discuss here some selected issues, along with some comments on the controversial Land Acquisition Act of 2013, to which Mr. Panda referred to. I think the Land Acquisition Act, I'll call it LAA, in my judgment is a step in the right direction away from the colonial law, but it's highly flawed. And there are many issues involved, but I'm going to refer to only 3 or 4 major issues. First question, some people say, why do you go through all this trouble? There's so much political trouble over land acquisition. Leave it to the market. Let it be between buyer and seller. Let it sort it out themselves. So others say, no, the state should do it. So state or market? My answer, which is maybe a highly controversial answer, neither. It cannot be left to the market. There are many problems with that, and let me cite some. There is always a hold-up problem. If you leave things to the buyers and sellers, then some seller can hold it up the whole process. And in a sense, the bargaining may involve when everybody else is selling, but you are holding it up. Second issue is that for the buyer's point of view, it is sometimes very difficult to negotiate given our tiny firms to negotiate with so many land sellers. In the well-known case, the notorious case, if I may say so, of Singur in West Bengal, the number of sellers involved were for 1,000 acres of land, which the Tatas were trying to acquire. The number of sellers involved were 12,000. So you can imagine the transaction and negotiation costs